All right, greetings environmental epidemiology class, and in this particular video we're going to focus on doing an actual 9 to 11 minute presentation. Now the clock for me isn't going to start until we get started with this presentation, but in general when you do your presentation, it's not going to be based on how long it takes you to start the recorder before you start your presentation if you don't edit your video and all of that. So it'll be based on when your presentation starts. I'm using Screencast-O-Matic to do this video, and this particular article, if you were interested, is called Exposure to Dogs and Cats in the First Year of Life. And one aspect that the students should have put in the presentation was where the authors came from. And I can zoom in on this, and it shows where the authors are from, and they were from the Henry Ford Health System in Detroit and from Wayne State University, which actually has been involved in some of the coronavirus studies that I've seen recently. And also, it's important to know that these authors have had some sort of support from different pharmaceutical companies. So that's good to know. That information was omitted in the presentation from the student. Anyways, to get this started, we'll roll here. So your clock would start, and the goal is 9 to 11 minutes for optimal points. You only lose 1 point out of like 28. You go to 27 out of 28 if you take like 8 to 12 minutes. So as I hit the 2-minute mark, I'll get started. All right, so we're at 2 minutes. So the article that's being presented here focuses on exposure to dogs and cats in the first year of a baby's life, the first year of human life, and the risk of allergic sensitization at year 6 and 7 of age. And this article was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2002. And JAMA has an extremely high impact factor, 51.73, and an H5 index that's 211 on Google Scholar. So it's a very strong journal. The authors, based on what you just saw, they're from the Henry Ford Medical Center in Detroit and Wayne State University, and their only conflicts were they had previously received some money, or at least one of the authors did, from some pharmaceutical companies. But there's no benefits to pharmaceuticals described in this paper. Background. Ideally, you would cite references here and cite the references from the paper. It's very easy to do. They all have them in their introductions. But in general, 62% of Americans as of 2012 had at least one pet or a dog or a cat in their house. And that's a large population that could be at risk if you're worried about allergic reactions. So if children are allergic, any dog or cat theoretically could cause that either directly through contact with the fur or just their pet dander. In the United States, there's been an increasing prevalence of asthma, and that's also true for developed countries around the world. The sensitization to common allergens has consistently been related to the risk of developing asthma. So people who have allergic responses tend to be at greater risk for having asthma. And some people speculate that an exposure to dogs and cats during infancy may increase the risk of subsequent allergy to these animals. The presenter did not mention that also in that paper there were conflicting studies that said exposure to cats and dogs in infancy were a good thing at reducing the risk for allergies. Kind of the hygiene hypothesis says that that exposure to animals and soil is a good thing. Exposure to peanuts is a good thing early in life rather than later in infancy. So anyways, that should have been mentioned because that's what informed the hypothesis. So the authors had a hypothesis that said that when they evaluate people in the first year of life and then compare them at ages 6 and 7, that they think that having 2 or more dogs or cats in the first year of life would reduce the risk of having allergic sensitization to multiple allergens during childhood. So they believe that being exposed to cats and dogs when they're young will reduce their allergic disease or allergic risk. So how did they do this study? They did the study by recruiting people in northern suburban Detroit out of the Henry Ford Health System Hospital. They did a cohort study, meaning that they followed people through time. They enrolled healthy full-term babies, so not C-section or preterm babies, but full-term babies that were enrolled in a health maintenance organization. So they had a health insurance plan between 1987 and 1989. In total, they enrolled 835 kids. They were able to get complete results on 474 of them at age 6 and 7 in life. So that's the major theme of the presentation here. The time in which they followed these kids, they followed them for 6.7 years in total on average. So some people got followed maybe a full 7, some got followed about 6. But overall, 6.7 years was the mean age at follow-up. So methods. Babies that were born at term, 36 or more weeks of gestational age, who they had successfully measured their serum IgE concentration were in the study. This is a measure of like how active their immune system is, just kind of a proxy. The study was approved by an institutional review board, the Institutional Human Rights Committee, and they obtained written signed consent from the mothers at the time of enrollment and every time they interacted with them thereafter. So they interviewed the mothers before the mothers delivered their babies to obtain mother education, whether the mothers had allergies, whether the mothers were smokers, how many siblings, brothers or sisters, did the mothers have and did the babies have, or the soon-to-be babies, and what was the cord serum IgE. So between the mother and the baby, was there a lot of antibodies or not so much? Because people that have more of these IgE concentrations or higher IgE concentration are more likely to be allergic to things. At age 1, parents were contacted by telephone and they obtained information about how many pets or dogs were in the home of the newborn baby. The number of dogs and cats in the home was used for the analysis. At age 2, when the kids were age 2, nurses physically went to each child's home to pretty much verify and obtain information about the home environment. They collected dust samples to see how frequently cleaned and dusted the house is. They also measured urine samples for biomarkers of passive cigarette smoke exposure. Because, believe it or not, if you interview people at age 1 by the phone, do you smoke? Parents are going to say, oh no, we got a newborn baby, we would never smoke. So they had to verify this to avoid social desirability bias. At age 3, 5, and 6 for the babies, or now the growing toddlers and young kids, telephone interviews were done. And then a second home visit was done when the kids were 4 years old. But this is where most of the action is and the results of this particular paper. Age 6 and 7. At age 6 and 7, they actually did a clinical evaluation with the kids. They did these skin prick tests where they kind of pricked the kid with a extract of dust mites. It also includes ragweed. If you've ever done an allergy test, they do this stuff. It also checks for allergies to like bluegrass or grass pollen. It also has salt water on there to make sure that it's not the prick that causes the allergic response. So salt water is saline, it's a negative control, and it includes histamine to make sure that it actually works, because elevated levels of histamine are guaranteed to cause an allergic response in almost every human being if they've got a healthy immune system. The skin prick test, if the flaring was at least 10 millimeters around where the prick was at, then they deemed that that was positive. And if there was no response or was less than 10 millimeters, it was not a response. atopy is what it's called when they have a positive skin prick test. They then did blood sampling, and blood sampling used IgE levels, and when IgE levels specific to the 6 allergens were raised, they probably got too much text on this slide, or these last 2 slides, but IgE levels, and as IgE levels went up, they determined that they were seroatopy. So it says if they have a positive test result based on their IgE concentration. And then they did pet exposure in the first year of life and defined it as no dogs, 1 dog or cat, or 2 or more dogs or cats. So that's kind of how they defined it at the beginning of life. So now we're at about 8 minutes into the talk, 8.5 minutes. So that leaves us with about 2.5 minutes to finish up. So odds ratios, they were obtained using logistic regression, using statistical software. They adjusted for their antibody levels, the gender, whether they were an older sibling or not, whether the parents smoked, whether the parents had asthma, whether there were dust mites in the bedroom, current dog and cat ownership. So they took all those into consideration. Remember, 835 people were enrolled, but 235 had been lost to contact. 126 of those had declined the participation in the evaluation. So overall, they only had 474 of the 835, and the average age was 6.7. Probably too much text on this. And yeah, too much text. So what were their results? Their results show the following. Kids that had no dog or cat exposure, 33.6% had some allergic response. An allergen immune response with their blood at age less than 1, 39%. Later in life, if they had less than 1, or if they had 1 or less, 1 dog or cat exposure, not much different, 34% and 41%. But when they had 2 or more dogs or cats at age less than 1, their 6 or 7 year outcomes showed 15% and 18%. 15% for the skin prick test and 18% for the blood test. The adjusted odds ratios show that people who owned 2 or more pets had 77% reduced odds of having atopy, a positive skin prick test. And then with the blood, it was also backed up, 1 minus 0.33, so it's a 67% reduced odds, or a 0.33, a protective effect from having allergies based off of the blood samples if they had 2 or more pets. So very interesting stuff. So this protective cohort study was strong because they followed these kids from birth. And they knew what the animal exposure was like at year 1. And they knew a lot about the exposures happening in the house early on. They knew information about the family history so they could do adjustment. And the association between pet exposure and less sensitization was found not just with one test, but both the skin prick and the blood level, or the blood levels. So persons who did the skin prick test were unaware of the study hypotheses too, so they were kind of blinded to why they were even doing this, and that helped reduce the measurement biases. Some of the limitations, as with most studies, they did lose some people. They lost 53% of them to be exact. Limited racial and socioeconomic factors, geographic diversity. So what about uninsured people? What about African Americans if most of the people were white in the study? We don't know if the associations that they observed will last into like adolescent or adult years. And what about being exposed to animals or dogs outside the home, like at the babysitters or visiting a farm? So they don't know about that. And then it's still a pretty big cohort study, but still only 400 people is not a whole heck of a lot. So larger studies would have allowed it to be better. In conclusion, this study did show that exposure to 2 or more cats in the home in the first year of life did seem to have some sort of benefits at preventing allergic sensitization and potentially even asthma. The association between pet exposure and decreased prevalence of allergic sensitization remained unchanged even after adjustment for potentially confounding variables. And then that's their references, and that's where we would stop. So, if that took 12 to 13 minutes and went an extra minute or so over the time, and you got 27 out of 28, or I got 27 or 26 out of 28, hey, you hit all the other points. The presentation could have possibly been done quicker by not including so much information in certain areas. This could have been reduced. And when the student who developed this presentation did it, back then, we had a 12 to 15 minute period. So I'm trying to speed this up for you, because if you go over 15 minutes for 3 points and you're using Screencast-O-Matic, it'll cut you off. 15 minutes is the free version limit. So trying to keep these at 10 minutes is optimal, and then getting at 12 minutes or 11 minutes for 3 points is good. Being at 12 to 14 minutes is still okay. But optimal points, 9 to 11 minutes. You only lose 1 point if you go like 11 to 13 minutes. So I would have lost a point. So that's all for now. If you have questions, you can always contact me. You definitely want to make sure you include this kind of information somewhere in there. You don't have to show the big table, but if you do, that's great. And you don't have to have so much on the methods. The results are really important. So I'll stop there and do another one.